Emulation is something that has been really popular and desirable ever since film started to be superseded by digital, and DPs were kind of wanting to hang on to it, and if sometimes forced to use digital where they didn't want to, they were keen to get that look back. That lessened, but it's actually picking up again as people are actually there's a bit of a resurgence in people wanting that texture and that color and that sort of organic quality of film. There's an awful lot of platitudes that get bandied around about film. I think there's a lot of kind of rose tinted looking back upon what people used to use. But there is definitely a lot of merit in the way that film handles colors, and there is a distinct look to it. And if that's a look that your client wants, then film emulation is the way you're going to go. And there are a number of different ways that you can emulate film. I'm going to try and look at a selection of them now. And to help me kind of demonstrate this to you, this is a project I'm about to start working on anyway, and the DP and director who are responsible for this music video have kindly said that I can use it in this course to show you how this process is going to work. But this is a genuine music video. The processed film stock has literally just come back in the last 24 hours and been delivered to me. The rushes look great. I can't wait to actually grade this. But first of all, before we kind of delve in too much, I just wanted to talk about the three main things that define for me what film look is, and when you're emulating film, what you're kind of looking for. For me, those three main qualities of film are the texture, the color, and something called halation, which is essentially an aberration to do with film and the way that film works, where areas of high contrast, where the light highlights meet a dark area of high contrast, you get a kind of a blooming or a halo, which is kind of crossing across that boundary. It's a feature and function of the way that film stock works that you can't avoid. It's always present. You have no control over it. Halation becomes more noticeable the smaller the film size, so 16mm or 8mm, it becomes more of a dominant feature, but it's there in 35 as well, and it's one of those things that kind of distinctly looks filmic. One could argue this is one of the things that digital kind of fixed, but it just depends how you're approaching this subject. In the same way, some people would say that some of the sort of inherent weaknesses of listening to music on vinyl are in fact are what kind of give it its soul. So halation, texture, so the film patina, the kind of the pattern of the grain, and the colors, what happens to the greens, what happens to skin tones when you're working with film. All of these things kind of combine and give you that distinct look, and when you're tasked with emulating that, they're the areas that you want to focus on to try and get this close to working with actual film. So this music video is going to be a lot of fun to grade because it was half shot on Arri Amira, half shot on Arri SR2 on Super 16 film stock. So we got to blend those two together, but at the same time, I guess, and I'll consult with the DP and the director on this, but I guess we're going to want to try and leave some of the uniqueness of the S16 to kind of look the way it looks, but at the same time make the Amira kind of sit comfortably with it.
I think the reason that I love film, and I think the reason that a lot of people resonate emotionally with images acquired on film or that look like film, is going back to the sort of psychological response of colour in people. And I think if you grew up watching films shot in the 80s, 90s and 2000s, you grew up on films shot on film. So when you go to the cinema, you'd be seeing films shot on film. Okay, granted, they all look wildly different, different costume, different periods, different looks, different cinematography that sets them apart. But there was one common tie, and that was that it was acquired on film. Granted, different film stocks, but there is a commonality in film and what that does to colour and texture, especially with things like skin tone, and yeah. The sort of the fact that it's a subtractive colour space and things like that is coherent across different film stocks and things like that. So I think when you're looking at images shot on film or that look like film, I think it taps into that sort of childlike response to a world, and I think you might associate film with celluloid. So yeah, I'm quite passionate about it. Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think it's a subconscious thing. I don't think it's technical. I don't think you notice it's film and like it more. I think it just feels right.
This is all of the Super 16 stuff. So it's come back from the developers as a single Apple ProRes 4x4 file in 2K. And then this is just a sample of some of the shots that have come back from the Amira. Classic Amira look, very clean, faithful colors. We've got, nice detail, no halation. No texture really in the sense of grain, obviously, being digital. And the colours of ARRI are very naturalistic. ARRI's cameras are famed for their very kind of nuanced and subtle colour palette that is recreated digitally, which actually has always been quite faithful to the way that film works, which is why so many film DPs have been comfortable working with ARRI going forwards into digital. So we're already coming from a relatively good kind of starting point. We are at least matching ARRI to ARRI, albeit completely different mediums. I think the first thing to do is to tackle the colour. So the colours and how the film stock responds to those colours and represents them, and how the colours are showing up in the stuff from the Amira. So tackling colour first is a good approach because it kind of falls broadly into a primary grade kind of workflow. I would say then we would move down into a secondary phase where we would probably focus on the halation and if we wanted it or not. I mean, some people don't want that halation, even if they want the colours and grain of film. They don't necessarily want what is essentially an aberration of film, which is the halation. But if we did want that, how can we add that in, and sort of adjusting the levels of that as a secondary phase. And then finally, I think the grain over the top would probably be the final step, mainly because it's something that affects the entire piece. So the entire timeline will have the grain working on it in one go, because we want to keep that grain consistent all the way through. So that's the order in which I'm going to tackle it. So let's start with colour.
I cut my teeth shooting film. Love shooting it. It's the nervousness of waiting for the neg report to come back, and you sit up until 2 o'clock in the morning hoping it was all okay. I remember the first time trying to load learning to load a reel in the black bag. Yeah, I'm 16mm and 35. It's funny, I used to shoot tungsten film was what most people use, but coming from a stills background, I used to use the daylight a lot. And Kodak had a stock at 250 daylight and a 50 daylight vision. And I think now, really, the 50 daylight, I think is equivalent to about 14 stops. So stills cameras, digital cameras only just arrived there now. But no, it was great. I love shooting it.
When you're tackling colour then, I guess the first question is, well, how is this film stock different? Or how do I want my digital to match that film stock? So with this particular music video, I'm going to have to look at the Super 16 material from the SR2 and particularly the film stock that was used, which in this case was a Kodak Vision 3 500T stock. I want to look at how those colours are being handled and compare that to the Amira, and then obviously bring them together. So there's a continuity aspect here too, but once I've got those matching, I can start to kind of play around, but the color is the first task. So I guess the question in my particular case is, how is Kodak Vision 3 handling its colors? What is different about it? What's different about the color sensitivities of that particular film stock? To help me visualize that, there's a number of tools I can use, but probably the first tool I might come to would be Film Convert. So Film Convert is a great tool for helping us to visualize the differences in color between different film stocks. And the reason it's so good is because the team at Film Convert, their engineers have put a huge amount of effort into displaying with charts and recording and analyzing the spectral differences and the spectral responses of different film stocks to different sensors. And what's, I think, one of the unique selling points of it is they also then analyze the various different gammas and profiles that you get with the different digital cameras that people are kind of popularly using these days. So you can sort of load in a profile that matches the camera that you're using, choose a film stock that you want to emulate, and it kind of gives it the two halves that it needs to then hopefully get you something that's pretty close. I also like the fact that it separates out your control over the grain, over the color, and there's even tools in there to do a basic kind of primary correction as well. This gentleman's name is Archie Folks. This music video is basically him. I think he's in a big sports, like a gym in a school, and there's dancers, and it's got a really nice kind of retro feel to it. It reminds me of a lot of music videos from the 80s, which is great, being a child of the 80s. It's lovely. So this is a really nice shot, and I've just got this particular frame here. I'm going to drop Film Convert onto it. I'm going to click on Choose Camera, the digital camera. So obviously we're not choosing the film camera here, we're choosing the digital camera. ARRI, Alexa is the only option, but that's fine because the Amira has the same sensor, and the Gamma was log C that was used on this production. And click apply. What's great is you can download a huge number of different camera profiles from Film Convert's website, so whatever camera you've got, chances are you're going to have the appropriate profile that you can match to it. So by knowing what's being fed in, it can then sort of get a known starting point to then apply the film look essentially after it. As I bring down here, I can actually adjust. So there's my underlying exposure here. So you can see it's actually brought that right down. So if I just bring that up so that I've got a little bit more going on in terms of detail, I don't want to clip anything. Let's bring that up a little bit. And I've got temperature as well, so I can actually bring that down to kind of match a more realistic temperature for the shot that we've got here. So there's a little bit of kind of like underlying work, and then you'll see the film settings go on top of this. So this is kind of essentially happening underneath. So the next stage then is to look into the film settings and essentially choose what film stock we're trying to emulate here. So I'm going to choose the KD5213 Vision 3. That's the stock, and underneath I can choose the actual frame size. So Jamie was shooting this Super 16, so I'm going to select that. And I've got then sliders to pull back or bring up the color. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm actually going to take the grain off entirely. And let's just look at what happens to colors. So I can fade this up and I can actually see, so 100%, this is as close as you can probably get. And as I say, the underlying technical kind of engineering of this is very, very good. So this is a very close to ideal representation of what those colors could look like. Now I know that Jamie is quite keen for quite punchy colors, quite a lot of saturation in the image. So I'm actually going to push this up quite high. I'm going to get up to, I don't want to push it too far right now until he's actually sat with me and the director Theo Watkins. I'm not going to know exactly what they want to do, so I don't want to push it too far and make it difficult to come back. But I reckon around about sort of 90, based on the conversations I've had with him, is probably somewhere safe. I've also got the option to adjust the curve, which is essentially how it's mapping. It's a bit like tone mapping. It's how it's mapping the contrast from that film stock to the contrast of the underlying digital film. And I'm just going to use that just to set. I know that they want quite a contrasty image here, but again, I don't want to overdo it at this early stage. And then there is also then the final kind of grain here, which I can bring up all the way or all the way down. In terms of, I think personally, my personal preference is to have it kind of subtle, but you know, noticeable. So I tend to use a technique where I will actually put it all the way down, and I will just look really carefully and slowly up. And as soon as I think I can start to see it, I'll hover around about there. If I do it the other way, if I go on, oh, that's full, and then back off, I tend to end up in a place where it's more than actually I really want. So I tend to, it's better to kind of go from the bottom and ease up till you just about see it, rather than come from the top and ease off until you think you're happy. So I'm going to come from down below, and I reckon that around about 50-ish is where I just start to see that pattern, that grain structure, which is obviously synonymous with film and one of the things that makes people love film. If I keep coming down, we can do additional work. Now this is kind of like post-transform. So essentially we've got a neutral starting point coming in. We've got the film emulation going on now, which has kind of transformed it. And now everything that's coming on afterwards is tweaks to that. So we've got color correction. We can adjust saturation independently. We've got lift. So we can bring up the shadows and make it kind of slightly grey shadows, if that's the look that they want. I know actually what they're looking for is quite contrasty. So they have a shadows control underneath that. Shadows are often a kind of a crucial element of how people want their film emulation to look. It's quite a telltale sign of certain film stocks. So the shadows with this, I can kind of lift them and sort of get them all sort of grey, or I can crunch them right down. I know that Jamie and Theo are quite keen on a crunchy look, so I'm going to bring that down a fair amount. What I also know from talking to them is that they want slightly blue tints in those shadows. So I've got shadow angle and shadow amount. If I bring the shadow amount up on full for now, you can see that it's giving it by default a kind of a green tint there. I can actually change the shadow angle, which is essentially the hue, and I can move through. So we can kind of go for like a rich blue. We can go for a slightly kind of like tealy blue, which I think works really nicely with this particular shot because we've got the warm orange behind it. But we can push it in a couple of different ways, actually. What I think would look quite nice is to go for a slightly kind of teal and then just back it off a fair amount. And then again, just bring it up until we're just starting to see it, which is about sort of 60%. I've got my midtones then, so I can adjust my gamma. Let's kind of bring up, this is where I can kind of start to reveal skin tones nicely. And again, I can add a slight amount of tint to this if I want. So we've got various different things. I think we want something quite sort of natural looking, somewhere around there. Let's ease it off. We don't want to lose the kind of the color of the film stock too much. I'm just going to bring that down there. And then we've got our highlights, so we can adjust our gain. Let's just grab the waveform. Let's just bring our gain. So we're just sitting comfortably there. And again, we can tint these. Now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to push these more towards yellow. Let's come sort of more there, which is a really nice look at the moment. Sort of yellow and teal is the new orange and teal, apparently. So let's pull this there. I really like that. That's tending to work quite nicely. This is catch up with where we are. So this is our source, and this is where we've moved to with this film emulation. It's starting to look really nice. We've got black point here. We can kind of crunch down those shadows a bit more. We've got our midpoint. Let's bring up those skin a bit more, and then we've got our white point. We can just, let's try and cape. That's actually been the right place already. So a number of tools there available to us, and very quickly we've got to a stage where actually we've got a pretty nice shot going on. Let's just play through this. That grain's great, particularly in those kind of mid-tone areas. So on the skin, on the shirt, on the kind of the window frame behind him, that's working really nicely. I love the rich blue that it's got out in the sky, and I'm really happy with that. Very slightly, I'll tell you what I might do is I might just come back to my shadow amount and just pull it just a tiny bit more teal in those shadows, about sort of there, maybe a little bit more saturation as well. This is kind of one of the stages where I would actually kind of say, look, this is kind of your safe bet. This is your kind of let's just push it kind of look. Let's go for that kind of real sort of 80s punch there. I reckon actually somewhere around about there is quite nice. That's a huge difference, but that is going to cut together really nicely. I'm still going to have to do the same continuity work that I would do with anything. Once I've got this kind of matching nicely with the Super 16 stock, I can then start to kind of look at grading these things for continuity and letting them cut in nicely together. But really happy already with the results I'm getting just from Film Convert.
I'm a big fan of something that looks like film. Everything that I've been trying to do in my career in almost 30 years has been to emulate film using video cameras. You know, just as, you know, initially when I got my first camera, like, I don't know, 34 years ago, I put a bit of cardboard top and bottom of the lens to badly emulate a 16:9 image. And so, but when it, you know, I got the ability to actually start coloring, which was with my first NLE, which was Media Composer from Avid, I was able to do some actual grading. And initially I was making things very contrasty and overly saturated, and then I wanted to then like lift my black levels and change things around. But when Film Convert came along, I think one of the things I loved the most about it, apart from the stocks were emulated very well, was the profiles of different cameras that I used, which made things so simple. As long as you shot in a profile that they had in there, you're able to make matching cameras super, super easy. And it looked fantastic. You know, I've worked on projects which have had anything from a GoPro through to shooting an S-Log3 and even some RAW stuff, and quite easily managed to make things match. Making things match is fantastic.
So what is grain? What is it about film that gives us this grain? It actually comes down to the substance and the substrates that are used on film stock. So you have a substance known as silver halide, and silver halide crystals are what give the structure to the grain patina, the pattern that you see when you develop film stock. It's the silver halide crystals that are receptive to the light. So when light hits them, they actually break down, and that's what allows the light to pass through the negative and give you your positive image out the other side. The more sensitive film stock is to light, the larger those crystals are, and therefore the bigger the pattern, the bigger the grain structure that appears, and the less sensitive that film stock is, the finer the pattern that you get. So on a 500T film stock, which is what this Super 16 was shot on, I would expect at 500 ISO to be getting a relatively big grain structure. It should be quite noticeable, and that's one of the things that I'll need to make sure that we match between the Amira stuff and the Super 16 stuff. But grain is an interesting thing. I actually recall when I first started doing photography at college in the late 90s, before digital was even a thing, we used to develop an awful lot of black and white photographs, and I remember at the time sort of feeling like I wanted it cleaner and glossier, and I didn't want so much texture within the images, and things have kind of gone full circle now. Now I'm kind of like, oh yeah, let's see that grain. Let's make sure that we know it's there. It's a weird thing. I guess it's a taste thing. One thing to bear in mind is if you are filming with a project with film stock, is the general rule, although you can break rules if you wish, but the general rule is to choose a film stock and stick to it, and certainly stick to an ISO, a speed of stock, because if the grain size and the pattern of that grain is changing from shot to shot and scene to scene, it can be very distracting. So you tend to have a consistency across it. For that reason, when I apply my fake grain, I'm going to make sure that it applies across all of the Amira shots in one go so that they all look the same and ties them all together. But grain is a really interesting thing, and I think it's nice to have a little play around and see what you can do with it. So we don't have grain with digital, but we do have noise, and it's a manifestation of the same kind of thing. It's, if you like, a kind of a consequence of your sensitivity. In the case of film stock, it's your light sensitivity based on how large and how packed the silver halide crystals are. In terms of digital, then that's more about how much gain is being fed into the sensor at the point of acquisition, and the higher the gain, the noisier you get. Noise has kind of changed and evolved. There are lots of cameras still that have kind of nasty RGB noise, but I know particularly with the Canons that I work with, the noise these days is quite desaturated, and actually it doesn't look that different to grain sometimes. There was a phrase that was coined recently, certainly when Canon started kind of introducing their Cinema EOS range, where the noise that was coming out of those cameras was kind of phrased as being organic noise. It had that kind of desaturated kind of texture of grain, but was still digital noise. So if there's any noise present in that digital video, it's a really good idea to denoise that before you apply any grain, because otherwise you're going to have grain and noise at the same time, and it's going to look odd. So denoising is a very important step with any digital. If it's there, I mean, if it's not there, then you don't have to do it, but just check, make sure that there's no noise, and particularly in those shadow areas, before you think about applying any grain to your digital media. It will just give a more convincing result if you remember to denoise before you apply your grain.
For me, what I love about digital is that I can be much more hands-on. I can actually go in and color grade myself, and I can go in and play with the image, and I can be a control freak. Whereas film, it was all taken away from me. I had many sleepless nights waiting to go in, and you get, as I say, the neg report to see whether it was okay. And then you go into color grading, and it was incredibly expensive to go through all those processes, and it's certainly something you couldn't do at home, which you can do now. You can shoot what we're shooting now in 4K to a cinema finish and go and finish and grade on a laptop if you want to. Imagine doing that with film. Where I do think film would be very useful is if I was probably back at, say, uni again, I'd make all the students go off and shoot film, just to learn not to be wasteful, not to leave the camera rolling, and learn for exposure. Because if you want to learn exposure, shoot film. Go off and shoot some colour transparencies. I grew up shooting 5:4 colour transparencies. It's plus or minus a third of a stop. So, and people are worried about our latitude now. I mean, most people, you can do that now in exposure. It's the latitude's there. When you're in plus or minus, we used to process one sheet of 5:4 film, look at it, and then work out what to do, push or pull in processing to get the other ones so they sat perfectly and the exposure was correct. And that's how, you'd spend, I don't know, a day doing a lighting setup for one shot, and you shoot 6 frames. That's, you've got to be accurate when you do that. So I think it would be, as a training thing, it would be fantastic. Personally, I don't know if I could handle the stress of shooting it back on a job again.
There are other ways that we can fake film grain. So built into DaVinci Resolve's own library of effects, there is a film emulation effect. So we have film grain, so it's called Resolve FX texture. You've got film damage, if you want to do something quite grungy. So I've removed all the grain now from Film Convert, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply to a new serial node some film grain, which is Resolve's built-in grain, and you'll be able to see essentially the differences between the two. So if we look at the settings for the film grain effect inside DaVinci Resolve, right at the top we have the film grain presets here. So we've got, let's go straight to our 16. Here's an actual 16mm 500T preset. You can change your composite mode, so you can choose how it integrates with the underlying layer. This composite technique actually you can also apply completely separately as just a layer node and just change the composite mode. Overlay is the most common one that you would choose, and then you can sort of ramp up the opacity and adjust it. You can also choose there to have grain only, which is a good way of checking what it looks like whilst you're messing around with it. So we've got texture, so I can increase the size of that texture or decrease the size of it. So we've got grain size here, so I reckon we want that pretty big. We've got grain strength, and we've got grain symmetry, which is essentially the gamma of that. So I can adjust the softness as well. Let's kind of get that slightly soft. It doesn't look quite so harsh. If I then go further back up, I can turn the grain only off, and I can just see how that integrates with my image. Let's turn the opacity off and then fade it up. That gets a little bit over the top there. Let's kind of nestle it somewhere in the middle. And that works really nicely. There's advanced controls in here as well, so we control the shadows, midtones, and highlights if we want to kind of affect how that's going. What I know a lot of colorists do is actually apply different grains for different parts. So you might have a grain for the shadows, a grain for the midtones, and a grain for the highlights. Obviously that's completely impossible to do with real film stock, so there's an element there of kind of cheating it, but then I guess the whole idea is that you're cheating film stock. So I think that you can choose grain if you find that it doesn't work so nicely in your skin tones in the gamma, or if in the highlights it's not really having the effect that you want. You can actually look at using keys and layer nodes to introduce different types of film grain into different ranges of luminance within your image.
We do some fancy stuff with halation, but it's basically revolved around how film reacts to light and how halation only happens at the brightest parts of the film. So it's sort of isolated to the highlights in one way or another. And then obviously the spatial effect of halation, of that blooming. There's a few different techniques that we use. It's quite interesting to see how the different layers of emulsion halate differently. Stevie Edlin's done some really nice halation work, and the way that he does that is very similar to how we do it. And he talks about it in his display prep demo that I recommend every colorist should watch at least once.
So we've tackled color emulation with film stock, and we've tackled grain emulation with film stock. The last thing that I want to touch on is halation. And halation, as I said, is just a feature of film that is unavoidable, but it is a particularly kind of tangible quality of it. Some DPs don't like it, and actually they would just leave this step. Some DPs and directors actually like that, particularly if they're going for a more authentic kind of period piece. They will go to the steps of adding in a kind of a halation effect, if you like. Now, the way that I'm doing it here is I've actually created a node, and you can see around the highlights just over Archie's right shoulder here, what I'm doing is I'm just starting to blur those highlights, and I'm actually growing them slightly. So the way that I'm achieving this effect on the halation is the first thing I did was qualify just the luminance. So I've turned off hue and saturation, and I'm just qualifying the highlights, and I'm adjusting the low soft, so I can bring this down more or less. I want to make sure I'm not getting anything really below the very highest, brightest highlights. I can use the low soft just to feather that off. And I'm adding a lot of blur radius to this, so I'm actually making sure that this is really kind of pushing into the surrounding pixels, because that's what halation does. There's a halo between those high contrast edges, which is exactly what I have here in the Amira footage that I want to kind of simulate the effect of halation on. So by adding a lot of blur to my blur radius on my matte finesse tools, I can then do another bit more blurring. So there's some blur controls here. I've actually pushed these up. You can see it moving up. And that actually gets me relatively close. I'm going to blur that quite a bit. And then the final thing I'm going to do, just to make sure that it absolutely starts to kind of nibble into the surrounding pixels, is I'm just going to use node sizing. So this is the sizing part of DaVinci Resolve in node sizing, which means that only this node is going to grow. And because I've got a selection of just the highlights within that node, it should mean, there you go, that only what I'm selecting is moving. Obviously that's ridiculous. I just want to do it just ever so slightly. It's hardly anything. I reckon about 0.02 is a good amount. It's just enough to start to push it into the pixels that surround the high contrast areas. So if I turn that off and on, you can see that's a pretty convincing halation effect there. Now it is blurring all of that area of highlight. So what I would probably want to do is punch a hole within that. There's a couple of different ways that I can do that are far too time consuming for me to do right now on screen. But with a little bit of work and a little bit of fiddling, you can actually get some pretty good results just fiddling around with node sizing and blurring. And because it's a selection, it doesn't matter if I'm moving around. If I play through this, you can see it doesn't matter about moving. I don't need to track anything in this particular case because I'm just selecting those highlights.
Why do people love film? I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% too sure. Look, I think it's a nostalgia thing. It's like, as you said, you know, vinyl. You know, people have a nostalgia. They have fond memories of it. They like the organic side of it, the crackle and pop and all that kind of stuff. The impurities in it. For me, film, yes, it has a great look, but I don't remember it as an absolute glamour thing that everybody seems to think it is. And I do think the people that are sort of having this return back to wanting to shoot film have never shot film. They think you can't get the same look with digital. I actually think you can get the same look with digital. That's especially now with cameras. Up until maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, no, but now you can get that same look.
Another way that you can emulate film, which is probably the simplest way, but not necessarily giving you the most control, is to use a film emulation LUT. There are a number out there. Probably the best one I've seen is the Light Illusion Film LUT, which I've downloaded, and I'm just going to install it and show you what it looks like. It's a very quick process, this one. There's not as much control, but if you're in a hurry, this could be something that you decide to do. So I want to apply this to, let's say, everything. So I'm going to set a timeline grade. So I'm just going to create a new node for my timeline, so it goes across everything. So this is the equivalent of like an adjustment layer, if you like, in Premiere. And in my settings, I'm just going to come to my lookup tables section, and I'm going to click Open LUT folder, which takes me directly to my Blackmagic Design LUT folder. And on the desktop, I've got the Light Illusion C-Log to film LUT, which I'm just going to stick in here. Now, if I come back into Resolve and update my list, that's now brought it in. And I'm just going to right-click on this timeline node, and I'm going to go into LUTs, and I'm going to go into 3D LUT, and right at the top there we have my 3D LUT film log DaVinci Resolve 21. So that is a very quick way of applying that LUT, and that's actually now applied that to all of the other material because it's a timeline wide one. I would have to grade underneath that, so or I would have already graded underneath that, and then I've applied this at the end, and I could use the opacity. So if I felt like that effect was too strong, I can use my key parameters down here, my node key. My key output is set to 1, meaning it's fully on. If I set that to 0, it's fully off. If I set that to 0.5, it's half on. So I can actually use that to kind of fade on and off the effect and kind of get it where I'm happy with it. So that can be a nice quick way of getting a film emulation. The big thing there is I don't have the precision of choosing the exact camera that I've got coming in and choosing from different film stocks. But as a general film LUT, that Light Illusion one is very good, and they've done an awful lot of work again in the sort of behind the scenes to make sure that they are careful to make sure that the emulation of the colors that they're using and applying to this digital material through the LUT are as consistent and as accurate as possible. So I think this is definitely one quick way that you can maybe preview to a client and say, look, this is generally what we could get, and then possibly if they really want to go to town with this, you can then break out and go into the more specific ways that I've shown you to drill down into it and kind of produce a more accurate film emulation at the end, there's this fantastic opportunity here for us to match the Amira footage with the Super 16 footage and give a really nice, distinct, creative feel and look to this particular music video, which is really exciting. And these are the types of techniques I'm going to be using to get the footage from the Amira to match relatively closely to the Super 16 material and give us, and hopefully give Jamie and give Theo the look to the music video that they're after. I love working with film emulation effects, and I'm looking forward to finishing off this music video in the